There are experiences that shape your thinking about things. My interview today with Amir Tibon, a journalist who lives in Nahal Oz, the community closest to the border with Gaza, around the Gaza envelope, has radically changed my thinking. Amir and his wife were awakened on that fateful day, of course, and he explains it in the interview. But what was more important is that they were holding their two young daughters together in the family's reinforced safe room on October 7th, 2023. They were there for hours, urging their children not to cry while they listened to the gunfire from Hamas in the house next door to theirs. How they survived is a miraculous story. But they texted Amir's parents, who received the news at exactly the same time, and his father, I believe a general in the army, immediately came down south with only his pistol to try and retrieve his son from their locked safe room, intent on saving their family at all costs. In Amir's book, The Gates of Gaza, the great story, the terrible story of October 7th is presented from a journalist's perspective. I had the good fortune of driving to Nahal Oz today and interviewing him on his front porch of his newly built home, talking not just the story of October the 7th, but the political ramifications that are being felt far and wide. Here in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, 2 kilometers from the Gaza border, with journalist and author Amir Tibon. Amir, thank you for having me at your home on the kibbutz. Amir wrote an incredible book called The Gates of Gaza, story of betrayal, survival, and hope in Israel's borderlands. As a journalist, let's start at the beginning. And the beginning is not all those years ago, it was October the 7th. You lived here on the kibbutz. You were the closest to the Gaza border. You were here with your family on that fateful day of Simchat Torah. Amir, tell us what happened.
Well, first of all, Adam, I want to say thank you for coming and being here and choosing to record this interview here in Kibbutz Nahal Oz. And just like you said, Nahal Oz is the closest community in Israel to Gaza. We are sitting here right now. We are even closer than you said. It's about a kilometer, really, from the border with Gaza. And beyond that border is Gaza City, which today, of course, is mostly, either destroyed or stated not recovered from the war. It's a difficult situation for everybody what's been going on here in the last 2.5 years. And I agree that the starting point for the current calamity was October 7th. A day before that, October 6th, it was a Friday, and we were busy here in this kibbutz preparing for the 70-year celebration of Nahal Oz, because this kibbutz was founded in October 1953. And so on October 7, 2023, we were doing a celebration. It was supposed to take place that Saturday, October 7, at 7 p.m. in the communal pool of our kibbutz. This is a small kibbutz here. It's 450 people for October 7. Today, when we're sitting here on my porch and talking, about 60% of the population has returned, which, it's interesting if you view that as a success or not. We can talk about that later.
Yeah.
And what happened on that morning, this day, this Saturday, a holiday, a day when we were going to celebrate 70 years to the existence of this community, a very happy day, became a day of horror and tragedy when we had more than 150 armed terrorists, gunmen, members of Hamas, invade this kibbutz, this civilian community, and start going from home to home in an attempt to murder and kill and kidnap and destroy everything in their way. This neighborhood, this beautiful place around us. It was one of the first neighborhoods that was reached in Israel on October 7th. We're on my front porch. The house behind us is the Bomi at the time. The security coordinator of our kibbutz, the man in charge of security in the community and contacts with the army. The terrorists who came in around 7 a.m., they knew where his home was, and they came directly over here because they were looking for him. This is my neighbor Ilan Fioretino, and his story is one of many stories told in my book. He went out and engaged them, trying to protect his own family, but more widely, all the families in this neighborhood. This is a neighborhood of young families, homes that were built in the year 2021, 2022. Most of the people who live here have young children, school and kindergarten ages. I was at home with Miri, my wife. She's a social worker, and she works with the children on the autistic spectrum. And I'm a journalist. I write for Haaretz, which is the liberal voice of Israel, a newspaper I'm very proud to be affiliated with. We have 2 young girls. On that day, our older daughter was 3.5 years old, Galia, and our younger daughter, Carmel, was 1 year and 9 months old. And when the terrorists arrived, our home was locked, and we have these electric blinds that were rolled all the way down. We barricaded in what we call the safe room. Every home in Nahal Oz and other border communities has one room, which is built of thick concrete, and it is supposed to defend you when there is a rocket or a mortar fired from Gaza. It's important to understand that here in Nahal Oz, because of the proximity to the Gaza Strip, there is no Iron Dome protection. So whatever is fired from the other side usually lands here. And the amount of early warning you receive is 7 seconds. So, if you hear a siren, you have 7 seconds to reach out. So in communities like this one, the children always sleep in the safe room. That's the children's bedroom. And over the years, we have lived here since 2014. We have gotten used to this ceremony every few months of having to rush to the safe room late at night, early in the morning. And when it happened on that morning, on October 7th, and we rushed to the safe room, we at first didn't really understand what was happening. Yeah. But when we started hearing the gunfire and the battle that took place right over here between Ilan, my neighbor, and the first terrorists that arrived, this is when we understood it's a very different kind of event. We ended up being barricaded with our daughters in that small room for almost 10 hours. There was no electricity throughout the day. It fell very early in the morning, so we had no light, no air condition. We could not charge our phones. Reception was not available for large parts of the day. No food. And throughout the day, a lot of gunfire and explosions and people trying to break into the house. Bullets fired through the window here behind me into the living room. Windows cracking, people screaming. Very difficult day. I write about all of it in my book, The Gates of Gaza. We emerged alive from that day. 16 of our neighbors in this small community did not. 16 people were killed or murdered. We had 8 people kidnapped from our kibbutz. 6 of them, thank God, and thank the Israeli public and President Biden and President Trump, 6 of them came back alive. 2 did not, unfortunately. And we were evacuated from here very late at night on October 7, around 11 p.m. We were taken to a kibbutz near Haifa, more in the north of Israel, Mishmar HaEnek, that still hosts families from Nahal Oz 2.5 years later. And now we're sitting here and I'm telling you all this story, and there's so much more to tell. There's so many other layers and depth you can go into, but that's the big picture of what happened here. And everything that happened afterwards, all the terrible things in Israel and in Gaza and more broadly in the region, is really a result of the atrocities of that day.
That one of the things that when I was here in February 24 and I went to Kfar Aza, Kibbutz Kfar Aza,
Right to the north of us, yeah.
and saw the devastation, which I will never, ever, ever forget. I've never understood, with Hamas attacked, if Hezbollah had attacked from the north in full at the same time, and the Houthis had attacked in full at the same time, and if Iran unleashed at the same time, I don't know if it's a miracle. I'm not a fan of those things, but if that had occurred, it would have been a very different Israel today, I think. Do you agree?
Yes, my reading of that has to do with the on the one hand, evil geniosity, and on the other hand, clear limitations of Yihya Sinwar, the architect of this slaughter. Sinwar sat for many years in Israeli jails. He was actually, and I write about him in my book as well, because The Gates of Gaza is the story of Nahal Oz through the years. It's the story of October 7, and it also is a book that tries to explain the history of Israel and Gaza and how we got here. And Sinwar is one of many political figures that appear in the book. And he sat in Israeli jails for about 2 decades, not because he had murdered Israelis. That was something he did later when he was released from jail. He had sat in Israeli jail because he murdered Palestinians in Gaza that he suspected, were collaborating with Israel. And some of them he murdered with his bare hands. A very, very vicious person. And during those years in the Israeli jail, he learned Hebrew and he read a lot of books, South Israeli society and intelligence and military. And when he got out of jail and he returned to Gaza in 2011 and he overtook Hamas, I think one of the
on the deal for Gilad
Shalit. Yes, he was one of the 1,000 prisoners for one soldier. Yes, indeed. And so one of the things that Sinwar assumed, and I think he was correct in that assumption, is that Israel had much better intelligence penetration in faraway Iran, thousands of miles from here, than it did in nearby Gaza, which is surrounded by Israel from, let's say, 3.5 directions, right? Their only other opening is Egypt, and we have good collaboration also with Egyptian intelligence. So supposedly we should have had it covered. But I think he knew that if he had shared not the big plan, but the actual date and hour on which he was going to carry out the big plan with the Iranians or with Hezbollah, the Israelis will find out. I think he saw the level of intelligence penetration that Israel had in the highest places in Iran and in the most intimate places in Lebanon. And on the other hand, because his rise to power, you can say, was in counterintelligence, like literally his first job in Hamas was to find and murder suspected collaborators with Israel, he had a firm grasp of what was happening in his own backyard. And he knew that the Israelis would not know about this attack, about the time that it would happen, if he kept it within the tunnels of Gaza, literally. So while he did share the outline of the plan with Iran and Hezbollah, and that actually was intercepted by Israeli intelligence, Israel knew that Hamas was planning this. Been a mountain of documents over the years about their plan to break through the border in different points, and soldiers.
War games at the border. I mean, it was nice.
It's all planned out.
Yeah.
The date and hour he'd never shared with them.
Right.
Because he assumed that the Israelis would lie out. And he preferred to keep it within his network in Gaza, literally inside the tunnels, until D-Day. And I think that this decision, that's what made his evil plan successful and allowed all the atrocities that were committed by Hamas on October 7. But it's also what caused Hezbollah and Iran, which are much more calculated actors, to hesitate on that day. And eventually to join in only on October 8. And by that time, Israel had stabilized the northern border.
Yes. And that first 24 hours was the critical one.
One of the questions we ask here all the time is, where was the army for Assad? And we know that huge parts of the army were in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, 25 or so battalions.
I've got it, 1,500 soldiers from the Gaza Brigade had been sent at the beginning of the festival of Sukkot into Judea and Samaria.
I'm not sure about the numbers, but there was some movement of troops.
Yeah.
And in general, even right now, there are many more soldiers in that arena than over here.
Yeah.
But also on October 7, whatever was left of the ground forces was sent to the north.
Yes.
Because everybody expected Hezbollah to join in. So by October 8, the northern border had been stabilized. But I think the real question here was Nasrallah's hesitation to spontaneously join. And I think Sinwar expected him to do it.
Yeah.
But, we will find out much more over the years. More documents will become available. And some people who are still alive will begin to talk. This is a very important question, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the politics of this, because you're not just living through October 7th. As a journalist, you have a particular lens in which you view it. You're seeing history. You're not just surviving that day, but how did that change the way you understand Israel, Hamas, and the larger Israel-Palestinian conflict?
From the Israeli Zionist perspective, which is always my perspective, I am a proud Israeli Zionist. From my perspective, this day was the most terrible failure of the state of Israel, and it undermines the Zionist idea. Because what is Zionism really about? It's about creating a safe haven for the Jewish. It's about creating a sovereign, secure, strong Jewish nation in the historical homeland of the Jewish people, which is here in Israel. And if Zionism as a movement was born out of the pogroms and then later reinforced by the Holocaust, then you can argue that the very point of Zionism is to never have a day like October 7th. The very essence of this movement is that there will not be another Kishinev and that there will not be another Babi Yar. And the idea that I'm not going to compare the scale, because October 7th was much, much larger than Kishinev and much, 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 much smaller than yes. But the essence of it was that something like this will never happen to the Jewish people again, and especially not here in our country. So that's one way I look at it. If I were to put myself in the shoes of the Palestinians, October 7 is also a day of strategic failure for the Palestinian national movement. It set back the Palestinian national project probably decades. And it's true that they were not in a great place to begin with before October 7. Their movement has been divided, and there is really a cold civil war between two parts of it for a long time now.
Not so cold either.
There were hot
Between Fatah,
yeah,
Fatah and Hamas. Hamas rules, just for the listeners, Hamas rules Gaza,
and
Fatah
Palestinian Authority.
that rules Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, exactly. But what happened after October 7th was the complete destruction of Gaza.
Yeah.
And it was the loss of any credible faith in the idea of a two-state solution. And I think that will stay with us for a long, long time. I think Israelis were not very receptive to the idea before, but are much less receptive to it now. That doesn't mean this is a good result for Israel, because in the absence of a two-state solution, and now I'm going to share my personal belief, Israel is also heading toward a potential strategic calamity.
Yes.
Because as the world becomes convinced that the two-state solution is no longer an option, there will be greater pressure on Israel to implement some kind of a one-state solution, which I don't see as a solution at all. I see it as a recipe for another Yugoslavia. But it has not been good for the Palestinians, and if you're looking at what's happening in Gaza right now, it has been an utter disaster. And in the bigger picture, it's a day that set off a regional war that is still continuing to this day. I think Israel has the upper hand in that war, but at a terrible and still growing price in terms of human lives lost, in terms of economic and societal damages, in terms of Israel's international reputation, image, which we'll talk about, and the very fabric of our society, which is under great strain because we have never before had a war that goes on for so long.
Yeah. You know, before October 7th, and I was here marching in Kaplan with watching 100,000 people marching down the street of Tel Aviv, you know, not wanting the judicial reform that the government had, a deeply divided society. That I was overwhelmed emotionally, Amir, because when there's a demonstration in Australia, and I've been to my own over the years, you never see the Australian flag flying. You always see everybody's group's flag is flown. And when I was in Tel Aviv with 110,000 others,
It was all Israel.
all you see
Yeah,
is
sea of blue and
a
white.
sea of blue and white, and you realize that people are demonstrating for Israel, not for their own cause, which is about judicial reform and we could talk about that one, but it's a deeply fractured internal society. You've got judicial reform. You've got this very, very deep, I won't say secular religious, because many in the religious are furious about the Haredim not serving.
Yeah.
The Haredi out.
I think it's really a divide about
Very divisive society.
It's basically about the question of, the Jewish democratic formula. How Jewish, how democratic?
Yeah.
This is the question that is today the dividing factor in Israeli politics and society. What does it mean to be a Jewish democratic country, and where is the balance between these two elements of the country's identity?
Where's the balance?
Well, if you ask me,
I'm asking you.
First of all, it's a balance and not a contradiction. And that's very important to say outright.
Yeah.
Jewish and democratic country works together very well if you keep the right balance. And I think the right balance has to be that the Jewish element is, first of all, just in the fact that this is the Jewish country, that this is the state of Israel. And you see it in the symbols, you see it in the language, you see it in the connection to the land. It should not be imposed on anyone's way of life. And that's where I think there is a big division. My understanding of Judaism, the way I practice it, is different than any neighbor, who lives here with me and to the broader country.
The word we're looking for is pluralism. It's in religious life as well as in secular life.
Absolutely. Pluralistic, open, accepting. And I don't want to impose my Judaism, my understanding of this religion, which I find to be a beautiful religion, on anyone else.
Yes.
And I'm not willing that others will impose theirs on me.
So let me ask, as we look at these fractures in Israeli society, there's political fractures with judicial reform as an example, a commission of inquiry.
On October 7th.
Which the government will not. This government will not have.
The next one will.
And I'm thinking of the Agranot Commission after 1973, independent, judicial, got to the heart of it.
We have it in our laws, actually.
But they don't trust the judicial system, this government. I'm just making the comment. We've got the Haredi divide. We've got so much going on.
But I do want to say something, since you mentioned this judicial thing.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister Netanyahu was, as we all know, indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
Yeah.
And there are growing calls to investigate our soldiers, investigate our officers, allegedly for things, war crimes, they say, and so and so. Whenever Israel tries to defend itself from those accusations, from that kind of what we perceive as persecution and unfair, the first thing we will say, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, is Israel has its own independent judiciary.
Yes.
And it is a very strong, very professional judiciary. And it should be trusted with investigating everything, including the conduct of war, because it is so independent and so strong and so professional.
But it's not.
And those same people who say these words then turn around and tell their supporters, we cannot trust the judicial system. They're corrupt and they need to be reformed and so and so. This is such a hypocritical contradiction.
They're beating themselves up over the strongest argument we have in the world, that we have a moral army. It's not perfect. Israel is not perfect. Yeah. But we do have, and I've seen it because I have friends of mine serve, of course, like you, and you have served. there are guidelines, there are judicial systems, there are, all of these things, including when the Australian aid workers in Gaza were killed, and all of that was investigated. And the chutzpah of Australia demanding that its chief of army go over, or chief of the Air Force, go over to Israel to investigate such sailors. And he came back and he said, it was a fantastic, the process was correct. It was right. And,
I'm happy that there are still honest people, who are saying it the way it is.
So there's so many things to unpack about that. But one of the paradoxes is, Israel is the military hegemon of the region now, militarily dominant. It's no question. But simultaneously, increasingly isolated diplomatically,
Yes.
right across the world.
And in the region.
And in the region. I want to talk about that. Firstly, how do Israelis reconcile those two realities?
No, I think it actually makes sense to a lot of people, because people will say, look, we are isolated because we are doing what we're doing militarily in Gaza and in Lebanon and so forth. So I don't think people see a contradiction between these two things, but there is a realization among some parts of the Israeli society that the ability to continue to defend ourselves will be limited if we don't improve our international standing. And I think there is a wider understanding that if it were not for the specific support of a specific American president right now, we would not be able perhaps to defend ourselves at all. And this is a problem because historically Israel knew how to navigate the international arena and the American political arena and find allies in different places and never reach a situation where everything depends on the support of one country, one political party, or one man.
Yes.
Today, that's where we are.
Yeah, we are.
Trump tomorrow morning says Israel, don't go into...
Well, he's going to stop Lebanon and he'll go, stop. So we're busy doing what we have to do.
Lebanon, don't do this.
Finish.
Gaza, don't... there was a moment a year ago, after the first Iran war, where Trump literally stopped Israeli warplanes that were on their way to bomb targets in Iran. He literally said, Israel's Air Force, turn around.
Yes.
That has never happened before publicly, where an American president orders Israeli pilots, not through the, relevant official channels, but out in the open, says, stop. And they turned around.
Yeah.
Because today, without Trump, Israel has no support at all. Even in the United States, where traditionally every Israeli prime minister knew how to walk the line and how to preserve support on both sides, what's happening today is we are losing support on both sides. The Democrats are pretty much out with Israel, and now we are losing within the Republican Party.
The Vance towards Carl things.
Exactly.
So in this post-Trump world, and he has a use-by date.
He's got way more years. It's not rush it, but yeah.
No, but in a longer-term view, there's a strategic weakness here that Israel now abides by, where if the rest of the world, if Europe has turned against it, and the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, has a dominant position in the United Nations, and we just saw the Secretary General come out against Israel, do Israelis fully grasp the seriousness of the challenge, especially in the younger generation that have been brought up on social media and see Israel as the embodiment of evil in the world? Do Israelis get it? Because we feel it, we know it, we live it.
First of all, I want to say that specifically the examples of the UN and the Organization of Islamic Countries, we don't care about that stuff. The UN said that Zionism is racism in 1975. Now, that was, 50 years ago? We can live with that. The bigger problem is the second part of your question. That's the real issue, which is the young generation across the board in all democracies and even in Arab non-democratic countries that were beginning to shift toward Israel over the past decade or so. In Saudi Arabia, and in United Arab Emirates, you had some kind of a shift. Maybe less of a demonic view of Israel, more understanding of the complexity, some envy about the success of this country. And now, even in those countries, you see the leaders saying we are limited by our own public opinion. Our people right now don't like Israel. And of course, in the West and in Australia, it's even worse.
Yes.
This is the real strategic problem. What is being said at the UN or some other forums, okay, we can live with that. But when leaders of specific countries that were supportive of Israel, sympathetic to Israel, moving gradually toward Israel, are now turning their backs on us, and even elected leaders of very right-wing governments like Meloni in Italy. Or, we'll see what happens next year in France, but Marine Le Pen, she cannot run at the moment.
And it's like that her Meloni example in Italy is really an important one.
Yeah, she was a very pro-Israeli leader.
Very
and
pro-Israel.
Very much, critical toward Israel, using very blunt language.
But look at her population.
Exactly.
And then, she is following what that population is demonstrating in the streets against Israel.
There used to be an understanding in Israel that leaders will support Israel only so far as their populations support Israel. And maybe Joe Biden was the exception to the rule. Joe Biden supported Israel even at the time when many of his constituency were turning very strongly against Israel. And some would argue that contributed to his political downfall. I don't think it was the main reason. Anybody saying it was the main reason is exaggerating. The main reason was that he was becoming old and, just not communicating well.
Joe Biden is the last of what many of us lived through that age, the 1967 American Zionists.
Yeah,
the American Zionists who saw
the understanding of Israel as a miracle.
Correct.
That was really ingrained in his personality.
Yes.
But I think he was the last person.
He's the last of that generation.
Kind of stand of saying, I'm going to support Israel beyond my constituency.
Yeah.
Everybody else is not going to do that.
Yeah. Let's come back to this issue where there's the international arena, but let's talk about the immediate arena. I'm sitting here, I'm looking a kilometer ahead of me, and there's Gaza. It's flattened. Right? So let's talk about Gaza after the war. And let's talk about the Middle East after whatever, however that is. Is there any realistic governing model that avoids permanent Israeli station in Gaza, a Hamas resurgence, or complete chaos, which seem to be the three options right now on the table? Are we got to choose between the worst, the least worst, or are there other alternatives here?
Adam, there's actually a very good plan on the table. It's actually set out in very nice bullet points.
The Kushner Witkoff.
Yeah, it's the Trump plan. Yeah, I assume Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff wrote it, but it's the Trump plan for Gaza. It's a very good plan. It involves the creation of an international security force from countries that Israel has good relations with and that we can put some level, not total, but some level of trust in. It involves a buffer held by the IDF, not as deep as it is today, but still some kind of a buffer.
Yeah.
It includes a Palestinian government that runs the daily affairs of Gaza, which is not Hamas, which is actually an alternative to Hamas. And that's what was missing all these years, a credible alternative to Hamas. It involves reconstruction of large parts of Gaza. Basically, an area not controlled by Hamas is an area ripe for reconstruction, so people can have proper homes and decent sanitation and workplaces and education and everything else. It involves economic investment to make all of this.
But it all hinges on Hamas disarming?
I think it hinges on more than that, but this should be, first of all, mentioned every day as the plan.
Yeah.
And right now, it is not. Right now, there is maybe one person in the world talking about this plan, which is this nice Bulgarian former prime minister, Mr. Mladenov. He's the UN envoy for Gaza at the moment. He actually held that role a decade ago as well.
Yes, but he's now the chair of this.
He's a well-intentioned man.
Yeah.
But apart from him, nobody's talking about it. And we should be talking about it. I actually think Israel should be the leading country in the world pushing toward the implementation of this plan, making every effort to convince other countries that it is still feasible. Because if we don't, then we are left with the three alternatives you mentioned, which is protracted Israeli military control. And maybe that will hold as long as Trump is in the White House, but what happens the day after? The other option is an Israeli withdrawal, which people hear, everybody will just get out of their homes and get out of here. Okay?
We did that. We did that in 2005.
We're not doing that idea of a unilateral withdrawal without any determination of what happens. That's not going to happen. And the third option is the chaos you just described. And maybe we'll get some kind of a combination of all three, right? We get pressure on Israel to withdraw, Hamas resurgent, and in between chaos and cholera and God knows what. So the urgency of implementing this Trump plan is very real. And we're talking about Iran and we're talking about Lebanon and everything matters. But let's not forget that Gaza has not been solved. And it's like a volcano waiting to erupt.
There's two things here. There's the Bibi promise, which I'm going to come back to. We will fix Gaza, we'll fix Lebanon. Yeah, we know.
Total victory.
I want total victory. His words. We'll come back to the politics of that. I want to talk to you from the heart. Our hostages, and this is the hard stuff for me, our hostages were held in the homes of Gazan civilians, including Zohar Agamani was held in a doctor's home, man who subscribes to the Hippocratic Oath. I've seen the GoPro video, told you that, and I saw that, and it makes your heart hardened about the population of Gaza. I know, as a Jew, the last thing we should give is collective blame. But as someone who sees things from a left-wing perspective, how hard is it to be able to say there is an opportunity here with Gaza when the population is not reconciled to living next to Israel? I don't know if they are. I feel the hate for whatever the reason is. I understand how Japan and Germany were, de-Nazified, de-fascist. This is a different story altogether. How do we deal with this if a population wants Hamas back?
First of all,
you know where I'm coming
from. No. First of all, I think that the historical comparisons to World War II are always interested but limited.
Yeah.
When we talk about World War II, for example, one question we should be asking ourselves is, what could have happened if Churchill and Roosevelt, when they went to war against the evils of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, had said, we are never going to cooperate with the Soviet Union because Stalin is also a murderer and the Soviets have a wicked ideology. So we're going to fight the Nazis and the Japanese, but no way are we going to cooperate and coordinate and work together with the Soviets. Would the war have been won? And one of my criticisms, for example, if we now bring it back to the reality of Gaza and Hamas, is this position that was held by Prime Minister Netanyahu from the beginning of the war, saying, whatever happens in Gaza, we're not going to work with the Palestinian Authority. By extension of that, we're not going to work working with Egypt. And we're going to turn down any opportunity for alternative Palestinian governance to Hamas, except for some fantasy about, whatever.
Yeah.
Because if you're not willing to work with somebody on the Palestinian side, you're always going to get Hamas again. That's just the choice. And there was a moment when Trump floated this fantasy about pushing all the Palestinians out of Gaza, 2 million people. Do you know a country today, Adam, that happily take in 2 million Muslim Palestinians from a war-torn region? Where is that country?
But they don't even have rights today in Saudi Arabia and in Jordan and in Lebanon and in Syria.
Yeah, but
it's unrealistic. It's unrealistic.
Taking them in.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not happening. They are here to stay. We are here to stay.
1,000 have come to Australia. Humanity.
Good luck to them. Good luck to them. There are also a few thousand Israelis, I think, that have moved to Syria since October 7.
Good luck to them.
Exactly. Yeah, good luck to everybody. Have a great class. But they are not going anywhere, and we are not going anywhere. Nahal Oz is here.
Yeah.
how do we create long-term security for the people living here? How do we avoid catastrophe and maybe even create a better life over there? Yeah, that should be the guiding question. And over time, I do believe it is also possible to decrease the levels of hate and incitement and create different curriculums and different education and make it possible, maybe, in decades from now, to even create a possibility of peace. It's going to be a very, very slow, very patient process. But the first step has to be to stabilize the situation. And stabilizing it means you have to work with this framework of the Trump plan. Because apart from that, you have nothing. Apart from that, you have an entrenched military presence that at some point will become the pressure point of an international campaign against Israel. And then what?
Yeah.
And then what?
And then back to stalemate. Is that same old, yeah? So let's talk about Bibi then. Okay? Let's talk about Bibi. So he remains one of the most polarizing figures in Israeli history. There is no question about it. You've observed him very closely over many years. Then we're going to talk about Mahmoud Abbas as well and the Palestinian Authority.
I read one book about Mahmoud Abbas, and maybe I'll write a book about Netanyahu. So it's
yeah.
Let's say I wrote a book about Mahmoud Abbas, but I've written way more newspaper stories about Netanyahu.
What do his supporters understand about him that his critics often miss? It's a puzzle to me. We all know the problems. We all know he called for total victory. He didn't get it. He had the conception of Gaza. It was completely wrong. We know all that. What are people seeing?
No, Adam, I think that before October 7, it was easier to answer this question. Today, I'm not sure what the answer was. Before October 7, while I was not a fan at all, to say the least, I could at least point to some reality that would maybe explain it. I would actually argue that even before October 7, one point where I think it really should have been a breaking point was 2021, what we call the Guardian of the Walls, which was this simultaneous surprise attack from Hamas on Israel, including rockets fired at Jerusalem during the Jerusalem Day Parade marking the victory of 1967, and at the same time a complete collapse of law and order inside Israel, riots in mixed Jewish-Arab cities. My wife's uncle was murdered during those riots, Yigal Yoshua, wonderful man, electrician who lived in Lod, which is a city that has a Jewish and Arab population. He was driving back home from work and a group of thugs murdered him with stones. Just a collapse of the state. And that was the last days of the 12-year rule by Netanyahu from 2009 until 2021, because a few weeks after those riots, Bennett was able to form a government in isolation. I thought that should have been a breaking point. The man brought this country after 12 years that he is in power, continuously, to a point where our enemies attack us. And by the way, it was from two directions. It was from Gaza and also from Hezbollah, but again, they joined a bit later, again as well.
Yes, it did.
And internal chaos and anarchy. I thought that should have been the breaking point. After that, I couldn't understand how anyone supports him. But he won the next election. And then came October 7. And by that point, I was a bit smarter. I did not think October 7 will be a breaking point for most of his supporters. I view it as a cult, honestly. And I assume it may be enough for some people to say, okay, khalas. Khalas is an Arabic slang that we also interpreted into Divu. Khalas, enough with this. A guardian of the walls. And then October 7. And then this endless war, which until now continues. We woke up this way. News about a soldier, this 19-year-old beautiful boy, the only son of a single mother, who was killed in Lebanon and Ukraine, and on, yeah.
And back in Lebanon, sitting, waiting to be.
So on and on it goes. It's hard for me to explain at this point. It's better if you had come here a few years earlier and asked me that question. I would have given you a better answer.
Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it? And he made
But
it
it's-
back in.
But it's still, significant part of the population. Israel today is divided around this question.
Yes, it is. Michael Oren said to me that Israel is divided on two things: the Haredi issue around not serving and the Commission of Inquiry on October 7th. And he said that will be a massive defining line in
The election, yes.
So most people have already decided what they're going to do.
No, I think the question of investigating October 7 is a bigger question of accountability and responsibility, because if a government can have such a disaster happen on its watch and then pretend like it never happened and make up weekly changing excuses why not to investigate it, then what's the point in having a government?
Yes. And that he acted in the first 2 weeks of this war was paralyzed. I'll never forget it. Ambassador Mark Sofer said to me, he said, we had to organize ambassadors to get things done.
I want to say something here about the Jewish diaspora. And this includes our friends in Australia.
Yep.
It also includes our friends in the United States and in Canada and in the UK and other places. But I also know specifically about Australia. We received so much help from the Jewish community on every level. And when we say we, I mean Israel as a country, but I also mean more specifically Nahal Oz and other border communities around Gaza. Australian Jewry, Canadian Jewry, our friends in the US, in New York, in Washington, in St. Louis, and San Diego.
We opened our wallet.
There's IDK, it's more than wallets. It's true that a lot of money poured in.
But we all came.
Delegations. We had delegations coming to visit us every week throughout the war. Just, emotional support around the issue of the hostages. And you would see how, unfortunately, there were posters of hostages being taken down in cities in the West and also here in Israel by, some people who were against the movement to release the hostages. And every time, you would have, here is in our synagogue in Melbourne. Here he is in our weekly protest in Sydney. That gave us a lot of strength to see. So we are always going to remember how in this time of need, the Jewish diaspora came through the Jewish world.
The Jewish world, indeed. Connected, yes, in so many ways,
I will never forget it.
Let's come back to Mahmoud Abbas.
Okay.
You've written about him.
Yes.
Okay. You spent years studying him.
Another leader who has been holding on to power for too long.
Way too long.
We spoke about Netanyahu, and this is even more true about Abbas.
So he runs a kleptocracy.
He's a dictator.
A
weak dictator, but he's still a dictator.
But a kleptocracy, because they're busy stealing everything.
Yes.
And I know his son runs the 3G and the 4G licenses, and they're busy.
His kids are going to be okay. The kids in Ramallah and Nablus and Bethlehem who are growing under his government and under Israeli
corruption,
not so much.
Paralysis. So what happens to the Palestinian national movement? Not only before his mother, I think, lived to 102. So he might have a few more years left, right? You know the facts more than me. So we've got these two periods. We've got this, I'm going to call it the interregnum, this period of stasis. Nothing's happening in the Palestinian movement. Israel is maintaining the authority, the Palestinian authority in the West Bank. And then we have this post-Abbas world. And what does that look like? And what does that augur for Israeli-Palestinian politics?
First of all, it's important to understand what the Palestinian Authority is today. The Palestinian Authority is a security contractor of Israel. This is what is going on. Pretty descriptive. They are doing work inside the Palestinian cities that the IDF would rather not do.
It was described to me as the Shin Bet is the biggest employer in the West Bank.
Indeed, yes. And they are running the daily life, the schools, the hospitals, the garbage collection. They're not doing a very good job on some of these things, but it's supposedly their responsibility, and Israel doesn't want to do that either. Okay? But they have no real horizon for statehood and independence, which was supposed to be the original mandate of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority was supposed to be a temporary entity that would put them on the road to statehood. And that fell apart when Arafat decided to launch the war of the Second Intifada. And Abbas inherited Arafat. Really, he's a tragic figure. because when he came to power, one of the reasons for his rise was the fact that, unlike almost everybody else in the leadership of Fatah, PLO, Palestinian Authority, it's just kind of like one big, conglomerate. He was against the suicide bombings. He was against the Intifada. This was his claim to fame. And there was some promise in his leadership when he took power in 2005. And,
Engineered by George Bush.
he won an election, and all of that is real. Okay. But as a leader, he failed miserably, because since he took over, everything has only gone in a terrible direction. They lost control of Gaza to Hamas on his watch. And in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, he has been relegated to, a place of almost irrelevance. And he's still accepted on the international stage, and he gets to hug with Macron and meet with the leaders of the Arab world in their summits. But how does that help people living in Ramallah, living in Jenin? What does that do for them? And I really believe that if you've been in power for more than 2 decades, no matter what your achievements have been, you should not be there anymore. And I think that's true of a prime minister in Israel who was elected in 2009. And it's true of a Palestinian leader who was elected and has held no elections since 2005. It's too long. And what happens after Abbas, I think, is a critical question. The Palestinian national movement is in a crisis today because it really had 2 branches. There was the PLO national semi-secular branch, and there was the Hamas religious jihadi branch. Hamas has led the Palestinians to catastrophe. I mean, October 7 and the destruction of Gaza, that's on them. Whereas the PLO branch has become, like I said, a security contractor for Israel. I think what may very well rise after Abbas is a new element within their movement that will basically come and say, the 2-state solution is dead. We're never getting our own state. The Israelis are not going to take down the settlements. There's not going to be a withdrawal from what they call the West Bank and we call Judea and Samaria. And therefore, what they are going to do is demand citizenship and voting rights in Israel. They will basically say everything between the Mediterranean and the Jordan is under full Israeli control and sovereignty. They will make the argument about Gaza as well, by the way. An argument they could not have made before October 7, but they would be able to make if we keep holding on to the territory. And they will basically say, everybody here is living under Israeli control. They will disband the Palestinian Authority, and they will say, we want voting rights.
Yeah.
This will be a very testing time for Israel, and it will come.
This is Micah Goodman's analysis that, you have to choose. Israel is going to have to choose between being a democracy that gives rights to the people it rules over, or it doesn't. And this is the great conundrum. And if they seek it, then then Israel is in a more difficult place.
Right now they're not doing it because Hamas is never going to do it.
But can you be the leaders in Fatah going down that road?
So Hamas, first of all, is too ideologically stubborn, in my opinion, too stupid to make that shift.
Yeah.
They're smart enough to do other things, unfortunately. We should never, think that they're incapable of putting us in danger. But this shift is too much for them because it requires to address the conflict from a point of weakness and not of imagined strength, which is everything they've been selling to their people for it.
Yeah.
Abbas is too old to make that shift and too settled in his ways and too dependent on the spoils that the imaginary 2-state solution paradigm has brought to him and to his family. I think the next leader who will emerge after him very well might take that gamble and say, we are shutting down this Palestinian Authority thing. We're walking away from the 2-state solution idea, and we are moving to a national popular struggle demanding the vote. This will be a very, very dangerous and difficult moment.
And we will need new leaders every week. to be able to manage that well.
That's a good point.
We will need new leadership. There's no question.
Yeah, that's a good point.
On that note, Amir, after everything you have experienced, the trauma, the war, the reporting, the displacement, the disappointments of our political leaders, the incredible resurgence of the IDF from its initial disarray, are you ultimately more pessimistic or more hopeful about the long-term future, firstly of Israel, and secondly, the possibility, however distant, of coexistence with the Palestinians?
There's another way to look at it, which is to be an optimist.
Well,
An optimist. And I think the credit to the phrase goes to Emil Habidi, who was a famous Palestinian turned Arab citizen of Israel, a writer from Haifa. And he spoke of himself being an optimist. You can see reasons for optimism and reasons for pessimism. I tend to be more on the optimistic side in my view of things. I wouldn't be here otherwise. And I wouldn't be, planning for the return of my family to live here. And I think Israel is still a country with incredible potential, with some of the smartest people in the world. Country where people care about the place where they're living, care about the society that they belong to, want to make it a better place. And with the right changes that have to happen in politics, we can make it happen.
Pessimistic? What's your pessimistic view of things? I know you're an optimist, but if it doesn't go well, because we have to, October 7th tells us we have to be...
Then I'll be honest about it. The stakes are very high. And it's the kind of situation where being optimistic is the right way to go, but you also have to be aware and conscious of what happens if we don't succeed. A lot of things are at stake.
And on that note, thank you so much for joining Behind the Headlines, Amir. It's been an education.